All right, so today we're going to be looking at body size. But before I get started with this class, let's find out how did we get here. So we established that there were probably 4.6 billion years since planet Earth was created. Then there were about 0.1 billion years since we got our moon. And there were about, after that time, 4.6 billion years, we had to wait about 1 billion years for the first forms of life to come, which were called the prokaryotes. During the first billion years in the history of the planet, what was cooking there was this thing called the protocell. Again, it's not really a life form by itself, but it was like a plastic bag that allows molecules to be contained, and that kind of became the precursor for you to get life. Once the life came out, you get the prokaryotes. Then from the prokaryotes, we had to wait a certain amount of time to get the eukaryotes, and next thing you know, we had 8.7, 8.9 million species that we are sharing the planet with. All right. Now, however, we also established though that once the species originate via one of 4 different pathways, they start spreading their distributions until they get to an area that they will occupy for a certain amount of time. That area comes to be called as the geographical range. One consequence of you having many species overlapping the ranges is that when you go and count how many species are in a given place, that leads you to something that is called the pattern in species richness. So another attribute that will change though, as you have many species living on environments and adapting to those environments and competing with them, is the fact that they had to also start modifying certain characteristics of the species, one of them being body size and the other attribute being biomass, abundance. So we already established that we just got to be super lucky in our solar system by having 8 attributes that make life possible in our planet. One of those attributes that is super important is the amount of energy that we get from the sun. So basically, if you look at that energy that comes from here, right away, that energy gets converted by a species into biomass. And as you can appreciate right here, the amount of energy that we get is going to change quite a lot from place to place. Once that biomass is allocated by the species, then the species will have to start again interacting with them, and that's going to start modifying their body mass and also their abundance. So one of the things that you will see when you analyze these 3 attributes of the species, body size, the richness of the species, or their abundance, is that commonly those 3 attributes on a given community are highly correlated to each other. And again, most commonly is because depending on the way that a species allocate that energy and how they optimize the use of the energy on different places. Let's jump right away into body size. So obviously it's very clear for you right now when you look at nature that different species have different body sizes. For biogeographers, it has been an interesting question why the species do have the body size that they do. After years of analyzing this question and collecting data, they found that when you look at the body size of a given species, it turns out that there are several ecological and evolutionary forces that a species had to deal with. So, well, it turns out that depending on these evolutionary and ecological forces, the body size is going to have a cost, right? But there is also going to be a benefit to having that body size. And basically, it's at this trade-off, at this optimum, where the cost is equal to the benefit that most likely will determine the body size of the species. Think about it. If for some reason you are living in an environment that has a huge environmental cost for you to have a large body size, evolution is going to start forcing you to have a smaller body size. The same thing goes places that there may be an excess of energy or perhaps little competition. Well, in that case, there's a benefit for you. There is not going to be cost, and there is a lot of surplus of energy. So most likely on those places, you are going to see body size going up. So again, when you look at body size, basically what we are talking about is those trade-offs between the costs and benefits in relationship to ecological and evolutionary forces. And then what we're going to be looking at today are what are these forces from ecology and evolution that cause trade-offs that will influence the body size. Obviously, when you think about how big you can be, one of the first drivers that you can think of is how much energy or resources are available in one place. Here is a very common pattern that is found in nature. Basically, when you look at the metabolic rate, which is the amount of energy that is used by a species over time, against the body size of that species, what you find is that species that are large normally require a lot of energy, so they will need a lot of resources. While species that are small, obviously they don't use as much energy, so the resources that they need are smaller. And again, this is a pattern that is found throughout almost everywhere in nature. The bigger you are, the more energy you will need to sustain that body. Now, then, if you put this pattern into a given landscape in which the amount of energy is going to change, then what you will find is that anytime that the resource available reduces, the consequence of that is that the body size will decrease, right? So again, if there is going to be certain amount less energy required when you are small, and the amount of energy that is available is small, that's going to force you to become smaller as well. The opposite is also true. Anytime that the amount of resources increase, then obviously you can afford to have a large body size. And that is, again, kind of the theory behind the possibility that the amount of resources or energy that is available in one place is going to determine how big the species are going to get on those places. However, when it comes to the evidence to support this pattern, there is not really a lot. This is one of the fewer papers that you will find about the impact of the availability of resources on body size. So this is the mammoth here. The distribution of the mammoth 41,000 years ago is shown here in green, red, and yellow. You can see that the mammoth was distributed quite extensively on the Asia and Europe. And by 2,000 years ago, the distribution now started being patchy, and eventually went extinct 9,500 years ago. That's the time when the mammoth went extinct. Now, that's one thing that we know very well. In the continent, the mammoth went extinct 9,500 years ago. But then these guys came to find this fossil of a mammoth on this island called Granger Island. One of the interesting aspects of this discovery of the mammoth on that island is that the individuals that were found there were 25% smaller than the individuals that are found on the mainland, and the fossil shows that this individual actually could have been there 7,000 to 4,000 years ago. That means that these animals managed to survive on this island 5,000 years after they went extinct in the continent. Now, why is this significant? Well, it turns out that on this island there were no humans, there were no glaciations during that time frame, suggesting that the reason why the individuals got smaller was simply because there was not enough resources on that island to sustain such a large body size, like the mammoth that we saw on the continent. Again, this is as you can see, that paper was published in the journal Nature, and the significance of it is that despite the fact that it makes a lot of sense that the amount of resources will influence your body size, evidence for it is very limited, with the exception again of this one paper here. There are also ecological forces that will affect body size. So when you look at, for instance, predation, which is again an ecological interaction between species, you will have what is called a predator, something that eats something, and that something that is being eaten is called a prey. It turns out that this ecological interaction can influence body size as well. And it actually depends on where that ecological interaction is happening. If the ecological interaction, for instance, predation, is happening on places like coral reefs, it has been found that there, the output, the consequence of predation is to make species, especially the prey, smaller, right? So you think about it, you are on a reef, right? Reefs have a lot of small crevices. So you are to avoid the predator, what you really gotta do is to become smaller in body size so that you can hide on those tiny crevices there. So you get to be big, obviously the amount of crevices that you find are smaller, and the higher the chance that you get eaten. So on coral reefs, evolution has made possible for predators to drive the prey smaller, and then it follows then that the predator also will have to become smaller just to be able to sneak in and eat their prey. So again, in coral reefs, the most common consequence of predation is to make the prey and the predator smaller. Now, in open waters, like when you go and swim in the middle of the ocean, it turns out that on those cases, the effect of predation is actually to make the prey bigger, right? Obviously, you don't have a place to hide there, so what you gotta do is to avoid being eaten by just not fitting into the mouth of your predator. So on open waters, the effect of predation is for the prey and the predator to become bigger. Another ecological factor that also influences body size is competition. So let's imagine, for instance, for a moment, here this is the abundance of individuals of a given species. This is the resource that is available in a given place. And let's imagine that you have two species using that resource, right? Here the two species are in blue, are in red. So as you can imagine here, what will happen then on this area of the resource, you have those two species using the same resource. If they have to interact for the use of that resource, that means that they have to start fighting and competing and wasting energy defending the use of that resource. And the individuals that are there obviously are not as fit, because the energy that they could invest rather in offspring or reproduction, they are investing on fighting against these other guys. So what happens on these areas where species interact on the use of the resource is that over time, the fitness of those individuals start reducing, again, as opposed to the individuals where there is no competition and all of the energy that they allocated to reproduction. So what you start seeing is that individuals start coexisting by basically adapting to the resource. This is what is called resource specialization. And over time, what you find again is a species specializing on different spectrums of the resource. So one of the consequences of this, of course, is that the species can specialize on certain areas by at times increasing their abundances or the body size as well. Again, just trying to optimize the use of a certain area of their resource. But what is the evidence though about a competition driving body size? So there are actually, we studied this for many decades. One of the first papers pointing out the significance of competition on body size was the work by Soule in 1966. What he did, you guys can appreciate this place here, this is the Gulf of California. There are these tiny islands inside the Gulf that are very similar in size. And one of the things that he did there was to collect the number of species and body size of lizards on those islands. And what he found is this. So when you see the body size, the average body size of the species on those islands against the number of species of lizards, what you find is that inverse relationship. So basically, when you increase the number of species, the body size of the lizards become smaller, right? So again, this is one of the first evidence to support the potential idea that competition forces a species to become smaller. In that case, for instance, here you have 6 species, and you can see the average body size of the species is smaller than on islands where there is only one species when the species gets to be very large. And again, this is one of the first pieces of evidence to support the idea that ecological interactions, especially competition among species, makes the species become smaller. Most likely, again, in their effort to specialize and survive on given places, they just become small. So in this case, you will say that smaller is better, or rather smaller is forced, in the sense that it's competition what is forcing the species to become smaller. I want to clarify though that competition is actually a very interesting, complex ecological interaction among species. And in fact, there are different ways that species can interact with each other. One of the ways in which species compete is what is called by interference. Interference means cases where a species can establish a control over the use of a given resource, right? Those are resources, again, that can be protected. One example of that is the territorial dancelfish. You ever go snorkeling in Waikiki, you probably see these fish there, and they have these tiny gardens that they monitor, and basically what they do, they have these algae that they patrol and they feed on. In this case, those tiny patches can be protected. The animal is there sitting, so anybody that comes around, it just goes and attack. And that's the way that these species manage to compete with other species, and is what is called interference, right? You can look at the keyword, this one species is interfering with the use of the resource to other species. And again, this happens in resources that are limited and that can be protected. I want you to think about, given this interaction, what will be the expected body size of these species? Would you expect those species to be large or small, especially when it's competition by interference? When you have to protect a given place from the use of the resource by other species, what would you think will be the evolutionary output of body size under these type of interactions? The other type of competition is what is called by exploitation. In this case, you have 2 or more species competing for resources that cannot be protected. An example of this is the chromis dancelfish, right? So you can see those fishes also in Waikiki, and basically these are species that you see them on the column of the water eating there. In that case, they feed upon plankton that is in the water. So you can imagine then that this plankton just comes and goes. So it's very difficult for them to protect that resource. So what they do here is compete by exploitation. Basically, anytime that the food comes, they gotta go and eat it as fast as they can. That's what is called, again, competition by exploitation, and it normally happens on resources that cannot be defended spatially. I want you to pause this video and think about what will be the expected outcome of body size under this type of competition by exploitation. How will competition by exploitation will shape the body size of these species? Will they make them bigger or smaller? Think about it. Another source of evidence to support the significance of competition on body size is what is called the Taxon Cycle. It's a process introduced by O. Wilson back in 1961. And what he suggests is that normally what happens is that you have a species on the continents colonizing these islands. Once the species gets to the island, obviously their abundance is low and their body size is large. So obviously the abundance is low because not many individuals manage to get there, and their body size is large because obviously for them to be able to get there, only those ones that are big manage to survive there because they are the ones with the energy and potential dispersal capabilities to colonize those islands. So generally speaking, the islands that normally arrive, the species, that normally arrive on islands are low in abundance and large body size. But once they get to that island, they have no competition whatsoever. So what happens is their body size reduces in benefit of increasing their abundance, right? Now, when the second species arrives, it's going to be exactly like the first species arrived, but it has a competitive advantage because it's now bigger. So by that second species arriving, despite the fact that their abundance was low, but their body size is bigger, it will have an advantage over the species that was already there that became smaller and more abundant. So the consequence of that is that the species that arrive first will be reduce their abundance because now they have to fight with second species that is more competitive, has a larger competitive advantage by being larger. So it will force the species that arrive first not only small in body size, but reduce their abundance, while the other species, again, given the advantage that it has had, it will reduce their body size as well. So you can imagine this thing going over time, replicating itself. That's the reason why it's called a Taxon Cycle. So basically, it's again this arrival of new species that are low in abundance, large in body size, having a competitive advantage that will force other species to become smaller and less abundant. But because of that advantage that they get, they also will reduce their body size as well. So that type of Taxon cycle will keep repeating itself over time. And it was a concept introduced by O. Wilson back in 61. Another force that will influence the body size is climate. So everything else being the same, one of the patterns that you find very commonly almost on every animal is that as you increase temperature, so is the amount of energy that you require, right? You can see that, for instance, on yourself. When you get hot, you start sweating. That's energy that you are spending trying to maintain that metabolism. So obviously, if everything else remains the same, one of the consequences of you increasing temperature, right, if the resource remain the same, is that the body size had to reduce, right? So imagine that. So you have to use more energy when it gets hot, but if the amount of resources remain the same, then the species had no other chance than becoming smaller. At times, they also become less abundant. But here, since we are talking about body size, let's look at the first attribute. This is a paper by Sheridan and Bickford, and here is just a case example on the reduction in body size of a frog between 1980s and 2008, and you can see the huge reduction in body size on this species. The only explanation for this is that the temperature got to be too hot. In that same paper, they found that in experiments that have been done in the lab, anytime, for instance, that you increase the temperature by 2 degrees in flies, for instance, what they find is that the body size of the flies will reduce by 3 to 70%, and in fish, again, for the same 2 degrees of warming, fish normally reduce between 6 and 22%, and again, that is just a consequence of the species having to maintain a larger metabolism when it gets hot, but the resources remain the same. Something has to give up, and in that case, is body size. And that's how climate, especially here temperature, influences the body size of the species. There are also human factors that will force the species to adapt in their body size, and hunting is one of them. This is a pretty famous display done by Flannery in his book in 1994, when he shows that, for instance, many mammals in Australia have reduced significantly their body size. And basically one of the things that happens, that's over 40,000 years, right? And the only thing that can explain this massive reduction in the body size of these species is the fact that 40,000 years ago was the time when humans first colonized those places. And the logic says that when you get there and you have the chance to eat from a huge pool of individuals, normally you will go for the individuals that are the largest. So this is kind of what another impact of humanity, which is selecting over the fittest of all individuals. Again, we normally go for the biggest one because that's the one that we like the most. Over time, that's gonna force the species again to modify, adapting. Since there is so much mortality on the bigger ones, the ones that are smaller are having an advantage, and over time, the consequence of this is that the body size of the species will become small. Fishing is another driver now having a significant effect on the body size of a species. This is a very famous paper by Lauren McClanahan. She was a student from Scripps. And just for you to know how easy it is to produce scientific papers, she goes into a bar in Florida, and in this bar that has been around for many years, there are photographs of the fishing trips. When people come from their fishing trips, they take photographs of them, and they have been posting these photographs on a wall. So she saw this, and she decided to compile all of these photographs to see the changes in body size of these species over time. And she has, as a result, this paper that is super influential in our field because it shows with actual data that it was not intention to collect it, how the body size of fish have reduced over time. So here you can see, for instance, photographs of fish back in 1957. Look at the sizes of these fish, man. These were humongous, including like sharks here. You can see a hammer shark here. You can see how big they were. Look at how small they were back in the 1980s and how tiny they became by the 2007. So right here you can see the significant reduction in body size in Florida, mostly as a consequence of us fishing always the bigger fish. Another example about the significance of fishing on the body size is the cod. So here is, for instance, one cod that was caught just this year, and it measured about 121 centimeters, and it was the world record as the largest fish of that species caught. The reality is that fish is only like about this size. The biggest one is about 30 centimeters, and this one guy got one that was 120 centimeters, and today we were so shocked that he actually made it to the BBC just to highlight the significance of that large body size. However, there was this other guy, Jeremy Jackson, that took paleontological data to find out how was the body size of these species back in the day. It turns out that back in the day, the Romans, when they were fishing and going in their expeditions in their boats, they were used to stop by the beaches and had their barbecues there. When they leave their barbecues, they ate fish, and sometimes they left, obviously, the bones. And the bones of those fish now allow you to calculate how big those fish were. So using that kind of data that allows you to figure out how big those fish were, Jeremy Jackson, in collaboration with other scientists, traced back how big this species was. And it turns out that this animal that today is 120, it's about 4 feet long. We think that it's humongous. Turns out that that was exactly the body size of that species 1,000 years ago. So 1,000 years ago, before the onset of navigation, the body size of the cod was 120 centimeters, about 4 feet. But by today, the species is no longer than 20 centimeters or about 18 inches long. So this is another example in which it has been fishing what drove the body size of this species small. The evidence to suggest that fishing indeed is reducing the body size of a species and having other consequences of an ecosystem was introduced by this professor, David Conover from Stony Brook. What he did, Professor Conover, he took this fish that reproduces relatively fast, and he took 3 aquariums, right? And on those 3 aquariums, he put the same number of fish, and in one of the aquariums, he took the smallest fish. He went and killed all of the small ones. In another aquarium, he took fish randomly, and in another aquarium, he killed the biggest ones. Over 4 generations, what happens was that in the aquarium in which he was killing the smallest fish, the fish became larger. It makes sense, right? So if there is a selective pressure against smaller fish, obviously those are dying. The ones that are bigger are having an advantage. They're going to survive. So over time, they're going to become bigger, while the ones that are killed large on those populations, the individuals, the population overall will become small. So you are killing the big ones. The ones that survive are the smalls, and then there is no surprise that fishing, what it does, it makes a species change body size depending on who do we kill. If we kill the large ones, the populations will become small. If we kill the small ones, the populations will become large. But if you remember the paper by Jeremy Jackson, what is happening in nature is that the body size of the species are becoming smaller, which then suggests that we are killing the largest fish in the oceans. Now, the consequence of us killing the bigger fish is the fact that the bigger fish is related to how many and how big your eggs and larvae are going to be. So this is one of tons of papers that document the size of the egg and the larvae against the body size of the fish. And what you can see is that as you increase the body size of a fish, you normally increase the mass, again, of the eggs or the larvae. And the benefit of that is that larvae, or the negative effect, of you killing the bigger fish, leaving populations based on a smaller fish, is then that the larvae are also going to be smaller, and a smaller larvae normally had a smaller survival. So the consequence of this, of the adults becoming smaller and the offspring becoming also smaller, is that when you look at exploitation, basically how much we are taking out of a population, normally what is happening here is that the input of individuals is smaller than the output. We are killing more than what the individuals are being added, and then it's not surprised that one of the consequences of overexploitation is that the populations will decline. Now, by us killing the bigger fish has an additional consequence on the populations getting smaller, which is again that the larvae are going to survive less, and then you're going to have even a smaller input of individuals, and this causes what is called an extinction vortex. So think about this. So you are fishing fish, no matter what, you are reducing the population, but it turns out that the fish that you are killing are the bigger fish that then ended up having larvae that are small, that have fewer offspring, fewer chances of surviving. So not only you had the population already incapable of supplying the number of fish that are being killed, the ones that are making it don't have the capacity to survive. So what happens on these cases at times is what is called an extinction vortex, in which the populations are taken to this point in which they will drive themselves to extinction, even if we stop fishing. Again, because we have made the offspring so small that they can just not survive on their own. And basically by you suppressing the input of individuals, you drive at times the species to extinction in what is called an extinction vortex. Let's summarize the class up to today. So when you look at body size and find out what is the factors that determine the body size, you obviously have resources, interactions like predation and competition, you had the climate, and then you had human-driven evolution, things related to hunting or fishing. And that's going to finish the class for today. In the next episode, we will be talking about some of the patterns in body size.